at Instruqt. We have a great talk planned for you today on developer experience with our guest, Daniel Bryant. Daniel is a technical go-to-market leader. In the past 6 years or so, he has worked in developer relations, building communities, sharing knowledge, enable developers to build at speed in the cloud-native world. And he has extensive knowledge and experience working with DevOps tooling, with cloud, container platform, and microservice implementations. You can find his insightful articles on InfoQ, O'Reilly, TheNewStack, and catch him speaking at prestigious international conferences like KubeCon, QCon, and JAX London. So actually, earlier this year, I came across his article in TheNewStack about the challenges of developer onboarding, and it really caught my attention. So I'm so excited today to speak with Daniel actually on this topic. So Daniel, thank you for joining us today.
Hey Connie, thanks for that intro. Make me sound very good. So I hope the expectations for the rest of the chat are the same, right?
I'm
Thank you.
sure. So let's talk about the challenges you have observed working with large enterprises when it comes to onboarding developers. What are the common challenges you have seen?
Yeah, Connie, I think like things like the obvious things that jump out is complicated tech stacks, large number of folks, like there's typically no standard way of onboarding folks, and there's just always more things to learn. Now, I appreciate that was like a brain dump of the overall like kind of like high level topics, right? Perhaps we can dive into them a bit more as well. But I think with the enterprise in particular, as you've grown over the years, acquired companies, and just like one thing with tech is there's always new stuff coming in. We know and love Kubernetes, right? We know and love Docker and cloud and all these things, but there's more and more things to learn. And any enterprise has a collection of those things. So it's not a case of if you're joining a startup, pretty much one tech stack, right? Java on Amazon, like sure, that's complicated enough, but you can get your head around that pretty quick. Whereas when you work for an enterprise, you're probably going to be doing service-oriented architectures, microservices. You might have some Java, some Ruby. There's been acquisitions. There's some .NET in there. It's just like the sheer volume of stuff you have to get your head around as a developer is massive, right? So I think that's one of the key things I see in the enterprise. But I do think it's always tempting to look at the tech first, right? And I love the tech, but the people are actually the hardest thing. I've seen this in my career many times, right? And the sheer volume of people involved in an enterprise. There's not only your colleagues, fellow developers, there's managers, there's leaders, there's program managers, project managers, like figuring out who does what and where you can go to get advice, particularly when you're onboarding, is really key, right? And I think that in some ways more so than the tech, because if you know a good person, you can often figure out the tech from there, right? But if you don't know the people to chat to, you're kind of in trouble. And I think just like sort of building on that as well, it's always nice to have those people you can go to, and perhaps we can break down sort of mentoring buddies and onboarding buddies later on, but having some kind of standardized way to onboard. In the past, I've used like Notion Docs or Trello or some kind of developer portal. It's very popular these days, for example. And it's really key to have a place I can go to learn more things, to if I'm stuck, a place I can go to ask questions, those kind of things, right? So kind of standard onboarding thing. And then critically, as I sort of hinted at my fourth point earlier on, is that portal or that location needs to be continually updated because the enterprise is like a living organism, right? It's constantly evolving, constantly growing. And what you learn one day, you need to learn stuff, clearly different stuff the next day. And critically, the next person onboarding to the organization is probably going to go through a different experience than you've gone when you've onboarded. So like the need to keep it up to date is really, really key.
That's interesting about keeping it up to date. I think one thing that I can think of is the documentation, right?
Yes.
How challenging is it to keep the documentations up to date with new releases and so forth?
Super challenging, Connie. Yeah, and I think really you've got to have clear ownership of that. So I think often it boils down in say microservices or the service-oriented teams. Like individual teams need to own a wiki or a portal page or some kind of like jumping off point. GitHub a README file, even as simple as that, I can start with. But then you also need an owner of something centralized because like it's very easy to get started sort of in a decentralized fashion, but you need that it's almost like perhaps the analogy would be like the signposts. Do you know what I mean? Like you can go in different directions, but you need somewhere where the signposts say, hey, working on this thing, go over here. Working on this thing, go over here. And in my experience, frequently that kind of thing doesn't have a clear owner. It might be sort of the HR folks or people team own it, but they're not really looking after it fully, right? And then the tech folks don't want to look after it. And that is one of the biggest challenges. You need the centralized jumping off point for onboarding, as well as the decentralized jumping off points too.
So I understand that engineers love to learn by doing, right? But to what extent is it possible at the enterprise that they can learn by doing without damaging like the live environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think even that goes the same with startups, right? I mean, I pushed code to startups when I joined them and broke a bunch of stuff too. But I definitely think with enterprises. So I do like to be task focused when I'm onboarding because like it's real then, right? In terms of like, hey, push this code to prod. And I think in some circumstances you can set that up for folks onboarding. Where you can't, where there isn't clear sort of low-hanging fruit or easy getting started tasks, where, for example, the system you're onboarding to is like super critical, on the hot path, or a regulated environment, that kind of thing, right? You know, you've got to be very careful. Having simulations on this kind of thing is good, right? Some place where you can play around within a sandbox that, you know, not production, right? It's kind of some kind of simulation or some kind of training aid, and people can critically give you feedback on what you do. So you can play around, you're doing a task, you know, but it's like a realistic environment. And you know, you can't break anything, and people can give you that feedback. Hey, when you did this, you broke this, probably shouldn't have done that, right? And in the future, do this other thing. So I think that is, you know, I've seen the same with like testing, same with many other approaches, or many other problems, sorry. When you can't use the real thing, a simulation can be really valuable. And to your point, like the enterprise, you know, is massive, and a lot of the tech involved is on the hot path, is on the critical path. So you do have to be very careful about the kind of tasks you give folks when they are onboarding.
So could that be also one of the reasons why it takes a little bit long time to onboard someone new, either from outside or to the team?
I think so, Connie. Yeah, and you know, there hasn't always been a great way to simulate these kind of things, so you just have to take it really slow and like have someone watch your every move. Like definitely when I was onboarding to code bases as a consultant, you know, 10 plus years ago now, sometimes like particularly in sort of regulated environments, literally I'd, you know, check out the code, I'd go and do some like changes, and I'd have someone like literally watching what I'm doing, or maybe not watching, but like checking my, what we now say is pull requests, that kind of thing, like very carefully reviewing my code, giving me feedback, these kind of things. So that stuff, it just takes time, right? It takes not only time, but clearly a lot of effort from that person who's kind of mentoring me, training me, or whatever. But that was
Yes.
the way, you know, we had to do it, right? And I do remember a couple of consulting gigs. It was honestly a week before I even got my head around the code base, really, because it was such an involved setup on my local machine, such an involved setup of the actual code base and how I push the code, and like a really involved setup of how I get credentials to actually release code in production, that kind of thing. So that just takes time.
Yes. Yeah. And there is maybe a lack of a scalable way to assess who is actually ready or who needs more help, right? It's kind
Yeah,
of
that's down to
more like a
people,
high
right?
touch approach.
100% agree. Yeah, that's a really good point. I sort of almost forgot some of these things, like, but yeah, I remember that, and I've even seen this when I was doing more engineering management roles. Like some people just come in and they just get it, right? And they're, you know, you're happy to give them the keys, rock on, right? Drive the Porsche, no worries. But some folks, you're like, maybe not the Porsche today, right? And you do want to give them like maybe the training wheels or the bike or something. So yeah, I've totally seen that, and that was often a judgment call. And again, not only is that, you know, time intensive, it's quite hard judging folks, right? It's quite sort of emotionally quite challenging. So like in terms of like draining energies and things. So yeah, like that stuff, like it is critical to make those calls, and particularly as a manager, line manager, you're on the line for doing that kind of thing. But not to underestimate the impact of that, I think is a really fair point.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing your perspective on that. It certainly sounds really, really challenging. And so let's go to the next topic on platform engineering. Actually, you know, it's a hot topic these days, but I actually researched a little bit, and I think like a year or 2 years ago, or maybe even longer, you already talk about platform engineering, internal developer platform, developer control plane. Now, is platform engineering just a trendy term, or is it going to really have a big impact on the software engineering world?
You're going to get me cancelled, Connie, if I start answering too often or too honest. I mean, I think it's a bit of both, and there's definitely a lot of value in like labeling things, right? Because we've had
Mhm.
DevOps, we've had SRE, we've had platform engineering, and they are sort of evolutions, I think, of the same process, but having a label allows us to form a community around them, right? So I think you can argue that the sort of platform engineering is the latest incantation of that space, probably definitely, you can argue DevOps is kind of a superset perhaps of this motion, or like the parent, if you want, of this thing. Platform engineering, like a platform, is a specific thing within the overall DevOps, like fast feedback loops, that kind of thing. And I think it was February 22, I did like a tweet where I'd been seeing this word or phrase, platform engineering, bubble up by very interesting people that I keep an eye on. And I put together a Twitter thread and it blew up. It's like my most popular Twitter thread ever. And it wasn't my ideas. It was like literally sort of collating stuff I'd seen out there. And then from then on, like, I'm not saying that it was in any way me triggering this, but a bunch of other folks were seeing the same things in the industry. And then like we've just rallied around this term. We have probably gone a bit overboard. Again, just my opinion, right? You can argue the same with the whole AI and LLM space, which is a separate topic here, but everyone's gone a bit like AI, overexcited, right? And I think we saw a
Yes.
little bit of that with platform engineering. But there's a lot of good things to like. And it's much like the topic of software architecture in my mind, that every code base you're working on has an architecture, whether you know it or not. And it's good to think about that architecture. And the reality is every software system has a platform, whether you know it or not, because every piece of software is running somewhere, right? Whether it's in the cloud or on a box locally or whatever. So that sort of forcing people to think about platforms and platform engineering, I think it's actually a really good thing, because we have reached that kind of critical mass now. We have containers like Docker, things like that, LXC. We have things like Kubernetes and these frameworks for running these containers. Now it's a case of matching your problem space and your goals with the tools we have available. Do you know what I mean? So I think platform engineering kind of helps people, gives people some tools, some frameworks, some thinking points on how to take all this cool technology we've got, but actually get stuff done.
I think, yeah, everyone wants to increase developer productivity. I think in your article, you also wrote a little bit about, balancing speed and thoroughness in onboarding. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, these are the two trade-offs, Connie, always, right? Because you can say, hey, push code tomorrow, and like that's fast, right? But like, in terms of like thorough and like the impact of doing that might be quite damaging to your earlier question, right? If I'm in a regulated environment, I might get fined billions of dollars, euro, pounds, right? So that is a constant tension, I think, and it is very much context specific. Like I've definitely worked at startups where you're kind of encouraged to like just do stuff, and if it breaks, we haven't got any customers, no worries, right? But like when you go into a bank, like no chance, like you're probably not touching the code for a couple of weeks or whatever, right? They want you to be very confident on like the blast radius of anything you're kind of doing. So very context specific, and I think you really have to then optimize for getting that sort of that feedback as well, right? In terms of like, um, are we going fast enough? Like, because you could say, hey, don't push code for a whole year. Like that's surely very thorough. We can train you up for a whole year, right? But I'm sure my manager would say to me like, hey, like I've paid big money for these developers. Why aren't they delivering value, right? So kind of it's that constant. Not only is it context specific, but that constant feedback loop is needed. Is that are we meeting both sides of this scale, if you like, right? The thoroughness, the safety versus the speed. And I think having metrics in place, and I'm sure we can dive in more into that in a minute, but having metrics in place that allow you to make some of those judgment calls, are we going fast enough? Are we being safe? Does allow you to then regularly iterate and evolve those onboarding practices you got, right? And you can, tweak, oh, we need to go a bit faster here, so maybe we need to invest in better documentation or more people involved in the onboarding, that kind of thing. Or are we causing, outages or problems, or maybe we need to slow folks down. We need to do perhaps verification steps to make sure they've really understood the processes involved with releasing software, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So, what best practices you have seen that you can recommend, to help to improve this?
Yeah, I think again, getting folks that clear feedback is really key, right? In terms of like, am I progressing as you kind of think I should be as a manager, right? Like, giving, because I did struggle with that early on in my career. I didn't always know the expectations. If someone kind of said to me, hey, we kind of expect you to be like understanding some of this code base within a week and maybe pushing code within 2 weeks, that at least gives me a mental model of how I'm doing, right? And then I think, you know, you cannot beat having like an onboarding buddy or a mentor, like to kind of coach you along, right? They can also give you that guidance, like, you know, hey, how you getting on? Like, we think you should be doing sort of this stuff, and is that feeling comfortable yet? And they can critically give that feedback on where I'm, you know, making mistakes or where I'm doing really well, and these kind of things, right? So I think that's like my sort of go-to recommendations there, and do try and keep the onboarding, the learning process as realistic as possible, kind of task focused, right? Because then it gives me a feeling of accomplishment. I've definitely in my early on in my career, I was sort of doing certifications, like training as part of my onboarding, and some of that was great, actually amazing, because I got certifications out of it, but it did feel very disconnected to the work I would be doing on a day-to-day basis. Do you know what I mean? So like, it was almost that training versus onboarding kind of balance, and I think we maybe didn't always get it quite right. So that actually having something a bit task focused makes me feel useful, which is kind of nice, right? As I'm adding value. 'Cause that's what most of us who are in, you know, in software development want to make a difference, want to have an impact. So
Yes.
giving like, so even if it's not like we talked about earlier, even if it's kind of a synthetic task, it still gives me that sense of accomplishment in terms of, oh, I can understand how I can have an idea, check out the code, get it set up, deployed, and that's in theory like when I could push a production, happy days.
Yeah, so interesting you bring up the training and certification. I mean, those are more generic, right? How does one translate that knowledge into working on, you know, a specific tech implementation in the enterprise?
It does depend on the skill level or the job level, I suppose, of who you're bringing in, right? Because when I was junior, it was kind of expected that like they'd need to put me on training courses because I didn't really know Java that well, I didn't really know Oracle that well back in the day, right? That kind of thing. So that was more sort of skill specific training I was needing. But when you get more senior, that's kind of a given, right? So like then it's kind of like we're training on like more of the actual system processes and applications you're working on within the company. So I think my first step is always like, are you training this person? And you could even like, I must be careful how I sort of phrase this, because you could definitely have senior folks that still need training, like when you're doing a new language, or there's like, you know, I know a lot of folks that are quite senior in their career that have like recently trained on, say, Amazon, AWS, because like,
Yeah.
you know, they've been working on Google or something else, right? So that's really important to like know when you're training versus when you're sort of onboarding folks. And then I think the onboarding, it has to be context specific again. Do you know what I mean? Because like
Yes.
I can learn Java, I can learn AWS, I can learn Oracle, and there's courses out there and sites out there you can do that. But the problem is
Yes.
every enterprise is kind of unique, right? In the like
Yeah.
the applications, the customers, the code bases, the people, the processes, all the things are kind of
Yes.
unique. So you have to
100%.
tailor
Yeah.
it to that org, right? And that
Yeah.
does require that owner and that proper thinking about like, what does a successful onboarding actually look like given all the things I've mentioned in this context.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Agree. On the topic of measuring and improving developer experience, right? What are the metrics or indicators can organization use to assess the success of their developer onboarding initiatives?
Yeah, I know. I'll be honest and say I've always struggled with this, Connie. Right? It is, and I think I'm not alone. Right?
I
It's
think you're
really
not the
hard.
only
Yeah,
one.
exactly. Yeah, definitely. When I was doing more engineering management, which was a while ago now, like I sort of got some value towards the end of it. But like, there's been a lot of amazing work done since like I started doing that. Well, since I left doing that. And I've got to shout out the Nicole Forsgren and Peggy and a few other crew that are doing a lot of work with like, they're taking the Dora metrics. I don't know if you bumped into Dora and Accelerate metrics, and they've got this SPACE framework now, which is like satisfaction, performance, activity, communication, and efficiency. And they've really done some like not only some rigorous thinking and some rigorous research around that, but it just makes anecdotal sense when I saw it. Like I really trust like Dr. Forsgren and stuff because like she's amazing and she really thinks deeply and works with the industry to like bring in all the knowledge. But when I started reading the SPACE paper, I was like, these metrics just make sense because it's very easy just to think about lines of code is the cliche, right? It's almost a trope actually, because like lines of code, like I can just, split one line of code into 3 and boom, I've tripled my productivity, right? Which is like not the way you actually want to do it. So they really thought deeply, and they often talk about looking at, say, on this space framework, if you're evaluating sort of progress or productivity, look at least 3 dimensions. And I think the same with onboarding, right? You can definitely look at things like number of pull requests. Now, I know Spotify, for example, one of their metrics of success for onboarding is time to 10th pull request. There's some amazing podcast blogs folks can check out, and I can give you some links if you want to put them in the show notes. But like that was a big thing with Spotify. Time to 10th pull request was like what they pretty much saw correlated with someone being comfortable with the process, the code base, and everything. So there's some obvious sort of like metrics around that, but you can also then back up that quantitative data with qualitative data. What's your like NPS, that kind of stuff, Net Promoter Score, or what's your out of 1 to 5? How easy do you think it is to work with the systems compared to what you've done in previous roles? So kind of backing up that satisfaction, that sort of human aspect, right, as well as the actual like metrics and like raw output, if you like, from the program activity. I really like what the folks with the space framework have done in this, and I think I'm still like getting the full value myself, because I haven't done lots, I'll be hands up, I haven't done lots with the space framework, but when I was working with Ambassador Labs, I know the engineering teams who I was working quite closely with were doing these kind of things. When folks were onboarding, it was very much like getting those core metrics of them contributing code and pull requests, but also the satisfaction, the human aspect. Are they comfortable? Are they happy? Are they finding the information they need? Right, was really, really key.
Yeah, that actually brought me to my last question is about developer feedback and insights. Like what you said at the beginning, right? It's all about the people actually at the end of the day.
It really is, Connie, right? And I think it's kind of strange, because like definitely when I got into tech, like I didn't get into tech for the people, right? And I think a lot of us programmers are like that. We're kind of introverts. We're kind of just like building systems, right? And it's like, oh, I've got to talk to people, what? And I've actually realized over my career that that's my superpower, being able to talk to people and bridge people and technology. But not every developer does want to do that. But the reality is, particularly in an enterprise context, you are always going to be talking to other people, like hopefully the customers, but if not the customers, clearly your peers, your fellow engineers, clearly your manager, clearly other project managers, that kind of stuff, right? And those kind of things I think are really important to sort of build into the onboarding framework and building into like just productivity metrics in general. Like, are people happy reaching out? Do they know where to reach out? Are they getting the information they need? That kind of thing is like I've learned in my career, like technology is actually quite easy. The hard thing is people. I know it's a cliche, but it's true, right?
Totally. Okay, well, on that note, I would like to thank you, Daniel, for sharing your insights on developer experience. It's really, really useful. Thank you so much.
Been a fun conversation. Thank you very much.